Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katrina Liku and I'm the head of the School of Political Science and International Studies here at the University of Queensland. I'd like to begin tonight, or this afternoon, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend that welcome to any Indigenous people we have here this afternoon. Furthermore, I extend a very warm welcome to Emma's family, who are joining us this evening, and to Ros and Brian, particularly Emma's parents, as well as all of Emma's dear friends and colleagues who join us here today. We've gathered here today not only to learn and reflect from our esteemed panel and speakers, but also to honour Emma. Emma was our friend and our colleague, and we miss her. Her creative and pioneering work continues to inspire us all deeply, every day. And this annual lecture, the first annual lecture, is a testament to her vision. Her exploration of emotions and images in international relations, and more generally than that, her commitment to addressing the significant political and ethical challenges that face our world. In remembering Emma, we celebrate the enduring impact of her ideas and the generosity of her spirit. It is a privilege to welcome you all here as together we carry her legacy forward. It is now my great pleasure to introduce you to Heather Zwicker, Professor, Executive Dean of our Haas faculty and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Campus Culture and Leadership. Welcome, Heather.
Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. It is my great privilege to welcome you to the first annual Emma Hutchison Memorial Lecture. This is a significant moment, the inauguration of what I'm sure will become a cherished tradition in our faculty. Emma Hutchison was, frankly, awe-inspiring. She excelled at everything: a dynamo in research, an award-winning teacher, and a gifted mentor. She was such an exceptional scholar that when she applied for promotion from level B to level C, the promotions committee unanimously voted to promote her to level D. That has not happened again in this faculty. But what made Emma truly extraordinary wasn't just her scholarly brilliance. It was the way she combined that brilliance with deep generosity of spirit. She worked with extraordinary dedication, even when facing serious health challenges, and she always somehow found the energy to push forward. She was incredibly enabling of others' work, and in particular, always had time for her PhD students. I'm so pleased that Emma's family is here, and to you, and particularly to you, Ros and Brian, I want to say, this is not the way that we talk about most of our colleagues. The person that you raised has been a gift to the world, and I know that I speak for all of us here when I say how lucky we felt to be in her orbit and how ardently we wish we could have stayed there longer. So thank you for sharing Emma with us, and thank you for sharing today with us as well. This is the inaugural Emma Hutchison Memorial Lecture, so I've been thinking about the concept of inauguration. The word carries a sense of solemnity and auspiciousness, a formal beginning for something significant. The word inauguration has a resonant etymology that goes back to ancient Roman practices. I am a professor of English, and this is an etymology lesson. The augures were priests in ancient Rome who would observe the flight patterns, feeding habits, and calls of birds to determine whether the gods favored a particular course of action. Before any major undertaking, a battle, a building project, or the installation of a magistrate, an augur would perform these rituals. So inaugurare in Latin literally meant to perform these sacred rites to ensure divine favor for a new beginning. There's something poignant and fitting about a practice based on careful observation and interpretation being used to honor someone whose work was so much about visualizing, about teaching us to see differently. Like augury, Emma's scholarship requires disciplined attention to what others might overlook and a thoughtful interpretation of what it might mean. Moreover, augury was not a solitary practice. It required witnesses and the development of shared understanding. I'd like to go a bit further with this metaphor and suggest that the inaugural Emma Hutchison Memorial Lecture is itself an auspicious sign, evidence that Emma's legacy of generosity, intellectual rigor, and collaborative spirit will continue to fly through this annual gathering. Augury was performed at thresholds, before battles, at city foundations, or when crossing boundaries. This first symposium is itself a threshold moment between grief and celebration, between Emma's agonizing absence and her enduring presence, between remembering and continuing. The inauguration marks our collective crossing of that threshold. And so the fact that scholars have come together for this 3-day workshop, that Roland is able to stand and introduce the symposium, that our shared intellectual work continues, even through the tears I know have been shed in this difficult anniversary season. These are themselves favorable signs. Emma's ideas, her approach, her generous mentorship, all of these continue to move, to fly, to migrate through scholarly communities. Today, we are inaugurating a space where those ideas can set a flight pattern that will endure for year after year. And when I say that we're inaugurating a space, I'll retreat from the metaphorical back to the literal and let you know that room 537 in the General Services Building, the place where staff gather for meetings, where PhDs conduct progress reviews, and where Pulsus holds classes and school seminars, that room that is the heart of the School of Political Science and International Studies. That room will henceforth be known as the Emma Hutchison Room. The signs went up today. So colleagues, family, friends, welcome to the inaugural Emma Hutchison Memorial Lecture, a living gathering, a moment of exchange and connection among people in real time, the kind of dynamic, collegial, and intellectually generative space that is so quintessentially Emma. It's now my honor to hand over to Professor Roland Bleicher, a formidable academic in his own right and Emma's life partner, who will introduce the symposium. Over to you, Roland.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you so much, Kate, for your kind introductions and for your wonderful support for Emma over many, many years, including naming our, what is used to be called 537, into the Emma Hutchison Room. Your words very much brought Emma alive. It has been a year now since Emma passed away, and it seems like one long blur. Time lived without its flow, says Denise Riley in a book on grief that Heather very kindly recommended me as one of several readings on grief. So I very much appreciate that all of you are here today. It means incredibly much to me, and I know it means incredibly much to Emma. During the last weeks of Emma's life, which we spent in the palliative care ward at the Wesley Hospital, we discussed a lot of different topics. Some of them, of course, were impossibly difficult. But Emma never lost her ability to smile. Emma never lost her thirst for life. And we never stopped discussing ideas and collaborating on our research and on our joint writing. So we discussed the idea of organizing events and activities that would keep Emma's hopes and dreams alive, her passion for scholarship and her quest to make a difference in life. The lecture today is one of these ideas that Emma and I discussed. We hope that it will become an annual gathering. I am very grateful to our school and our faculty for their sponsorship and for making this an official UQ event this year. So many of you in here have contributed to the organization of the event and supported us in general. If I thanked all of you individually, we would never hear from our guest speaker tonight. So please allow me to express my gratitude collectively and use my time instead to say a few words about the idea of the event tonight. We want to honor and celebrate two aspects that made Emma who she was: her passion for ideas and scholarship, and her commitment to make the world a better place. Emma loved creative scholarship. She loved reading and she loved writing. She lived and thrived in the world of words. But Emma was also very passionate about contributing to the community around her, making it fairer and more inclusive. Emma's bodily vulnerability, which Heather mentioned, made her exceptionally aware of power relations that privilege some but exclude others. She always reached out and stood up for those less privileged than her. This kindness and care for others is something that many people commented on since Emma's passing. So I could not imagine a more suitable topic for the first Emma Hutchison Memorial Lecture than the one we are discussing tonight: Mobilising Compassion. And I could not imagine a more suitable scholar to comment on this topic than Professor Michael Barnett. Michael is University Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at the George Washington University in the US. He is one of the leading international relations scholars in the world, and arguably the most influential voice on humanitarian politics. Rather than reading out Michael's extensive biography, I want to highlight that Michael is one of Emma's scholarly heroes. At home, we have half a shelf devoted to Michael's books and a massive stack of his journal articles. All of them are chock-a-block with sticky notes and Emma's scribbles in the margins of the texts. There are a lot of ticks and double ticks and triple ticks. So I know how excited and how honored Emma would have been to know that you're doing this today, Michael. Thank you very much. All of here are exceptionally grateful that you have come such a long way to join us. We are very much looking forward to hearing from you. So please welcome Professor Michael Barnett.
If I wasn't nervous before, I certainly am now. When Roland asked if I would be willing to serve as, the inaugural speaker of this series, I was actually quite anxious because I knew about the significance of the event, and that kind of worried me. Always ready for failure of some kind or another. But I also knew it was an incredible honor. And for that, I'm eternally grateful that Roland thought to entrust me with the task. To my great regret, Emma and I only met on a few occasions. And each time I came away, so impressed by her voice, by her ability to demonstrate considerable intellectual courage, her openness, her humility, her rigor, and her creativity. These are the same adjectives I've heard many use now to describe how she lived her life. And she has been in my head now for several months. And as I told Roland yesterday, as I was preparing the lecture, it was with a constant, what would Emma say? So this is in many ways the highest testimony I can give to a fellow scholar and colleague. The topic of mobilizing compassion seemed to capture an important element of Emma's considerable scholarship. Compassion is bound up with emotions, and Emma was a pioneer on the subject in the field of international relations. This is probably not a huge surprise, but scholars of international relations are not known for their emotional sensitivity or having any emotions whatsoever. And that probably is not a surprise to most of you. But her writings had an extraordinary impact around the world. She was a pioneer, as I said, in terms of persuading international relations scholars that emotions matter. Emotions matter in almost everything we do. And yet, in a scholarship that is obsessed with the idea of rational actors and the notion that we've somehow suppressed our emotive abilities.
You've got the clicker, the slides.
Oh, yeah, but I'm not ready for that slide yet. Okay. But I appreciate it. Thank you. And the way she was able to show us about the connections between emotions and compassion and humanitarianism, which is really how I got to know her and her writings, and became deeply influenced by what she had to say on the relationship between all three. And so I thought it would be important for me to actually use her own pioneering work as a launching off point for the lecture today. I should say, for preparing for this, I have returned time and time again to her magisterial book, Effective Communities in World Politics, Collective Emotions After Trauma, over the years. And each time I have my own go through it, there's a tick and a tick and a tick, and then a star and an underline. So I actually would like a new copy before I leave here today. So let's begin. Sociobiologists and neuroscientists reassure us that we have a compassion gene or something close to it. And it's even been developing over the millennium. Philosophers and humanists and social scientists have long studied what Martha Nussbaum, a very distinguished philosopher, said that compassion was a basic human emotion. We all have it as humans. But we also know that something seemed to have happened in the late 19th century, actually 18th century, I'm sorry, in which, in the words of Hannah Arendt, there became a passion for compassion. That for some reason, which I'll leave aside for the moment, we as societies, mainly we're talking about in Europe, became very much attentive to compassion and compassion for suffering others. It was this spirit that actually led the abolitionists, who had never met an African, who had never seen one in person, to become convinced that they must actually end the slave trade and end slavery itself. And it continued on from there. And then there were reform societies, and then there were Aboriginal protection societies over the 19th century. And then in the same moment, we also had the development of the ICRC, which was about compassion for fallen soldiers, regardless of the uniform they were wearing. And then it seemed to continue. Compassion was increasingly institutionalized and globalized, to the point that we have NGOs and international organizations and various kinds of so-called normative entrepreneurs who are constantly reminding us, sometimes berating us, to actually be the compassionate people that we have and we can become. And there are many scholars who have written in a kind of uplifting message about how the world has become more compassionate, and that for some, we're even better people than our grandparents were. So our ability to actually show compassion has stretched. Andrew Linklater, a very famous international relations scholar, wrote volumes describing and explaining the global sociology of compassion. The cultural historian Thomas Lacour congratulated a world in which he said, the suffering of all people, not just some, can be narrated. 2 decades ago, the philosopher Charles Taylor marveled at how the international community now accepts more oughts, the things we ought to do, and responsibility for more people than ever before. And then Steven Pinker, in a best-selling book 15 years ago, argued that what we've seen is the ability of all humans to tap into the better angels of their nature. And so what we've seen then is pushing this rock up the hill. And it's not because of any genetic predetermination. It's because of the role of humans tapping into something that they believed was innate, but that nevertheless needed to be nurtured. And that by showing more compassion to more people who are suffering was saying something about our own humanity. And this became a marker, compassion, of who we are as people and what we're capable of and what we should be if we were going to realize our full humanity. Well, see, I've already screwed up. I need to roll in. That's the previous slide. Okay, so don't worry, I'm not going to repeat. The slide's back, but now imagine that the rock is coming backwards. And I sort of looked at it both ways, and the first time it's Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, and now I imagine Sisyphus at this historical moment doing whatever he can to actually stop the rock from falling down and going and tumbling back down the hill. And it's, I think it's fair to say that the foundations for global social justice and humanitarianism have been crumbling for the last number of years. We all have different ways of measuring this. Some cite the treatment of refugees and migrants and other displaced people. Emma, Roland, and David Campbell wrote about this, I guess, 13, 14 years ago with respect to Australia and its refugee policies. Many have followed in their footsteps and have identified the treatment of refugees, those strangers in our midst who are seeking shelter, a safe haven. And it's how we treat them that becomes the measure of our humanity. Global voices have themselves been weighing in on this. The Vatican has rung alarms, first by Pope Francis and now by Pope Leo, that we have entered into a global age of indifference. And he's not the only one who sees that the way we treat the unknown stranger that's at our doorstep is a sign, in many ways, of our own inhumanity. There's something that, for them, has gone painfully wrong. And then, of course, my country showed you what that could look like. The United States was not the first one to cut the budgets for humanitarian assistance. European states were outpacing the US in that regard. But then Trump, not wanting to be number 2 on anything, decided that he was going to actually do it even multiple times better. And so, with his sidekick Elon Musk, a member of the Commonwealth, I just need to note there, not an American, took what he said was his chainsaw, severed USAID, and then another quote from him, fed it into the wood chipper. How's that for you? And this became, for me anyway, a symbol not just of our lack of humanity, but also bared our cruelty. And that's often what we see around the world today, is not just simply a withdrawal of compassion, but almost a sadism when it comes to the treatment of the marginalized and the vulnerable. I did not expect anything like what we saw with these tremendous budget cuts from the US and the dismantling of USAID at the beginning of the year. Nobody did. And we still don't know why, although we all have our suspicions as to why the Trump White House felt the necessity of literally killing other people who were dependent on US assistance, pharmaceuticals, in order to survive. Now, I've been following this with a fair bit of attention because I'm in the middle, well, I'm not in the middle, I hope I'm finishing a book on contemporary humanitarianism, which we actually had already titled The End of Humanity a few years ago. And this shows you a little bit about the times. When we first proposed the title to Cambridge University Press, they rejected it and said it's too melodramatic, no one buys it, it's not the end of humanity. And then the Trump administration comes and they're going, this is a brilliant title. We got to run with this. If it bleeds, it leads. And so we have a book now that is The End of Humanity, and I guess this is one way I can thank Donald Trump. We got the title we wanted. But one of the reasons why we wanted to title it this way was because what we saw was the end of compassion. And if compassion ends, there's no humanitarianism. As simple as that. And if compassion ends, then we have turned our backs on those who desperately need us. That those who are waiting for assistance are left to die. And I cannot begin to tell you of all of the horror stories around the world of people who have been counting on continued aid, who now do not have it, and in many cases have to find other ways to support themselves. So, for instance, out of many refugee camps, child marriage has gone way up. Sex work has gone way up. Criminality has gone way up because people need to survive, and they'll do anything they can in order to stave off death. So to prepare for today's talk, I will just reiterate that I've reread much of what Emma has written. And one of the takeaways, though, as I was thinking about this moment, was that on the one hand, as I read her previous work, there was a sense in which it is possible for us to tap into our compassion. It can grow. On the other hand, as I sort of turned her books and her writings upside down, I found a different message, one that's less hopeful in many ways, which is to say that compassion is much more fragile and fleeting than I think I had ever come to expect. That what we've seen over the last 30 years, if we take money as a measure, has been an expansion of compassion. And I think it gave many of us the sense that we were moving in the right direction. But I'm not so sure anymore, and this is a moment where I would love if Emma was here to tell me whether I'm reading her correctly or not, or what she would have to say. So today what I want to do, and the rest of the time I have, is to talk about, first, what am I talking about when I'm talking about compassion? Then I want to introduce you to this notion of hierarchies of humanity and circles of obligation, because we're not attentive to all suffering. We're discriminatory. And we need to, I think, come to terms with these elements because they're on our doorstep again. Then what I want to do is very briefly go through theories that may explain why there's been a decline in global compassion. And I will say up front, we have more theories than we have evidence. It's very difficult to actually get evidence on compassion. And all that brain imagery, work that gets done by neuroscientists can't really help us understand what's going on at the global level. And then I want to turn to what I think is a more controversial claim, which is that humanitarianism itself has lost its compassion. That's probably a little stronger than I want to put it, but I do think that there's something wrong, something that's happened to humanitarianism over the last 2 decades that actually makes me quite worried about its future, above and beyond all these tragic budget cuts. And then I'll conclude with some very speculative thoughts on the relationship between compassion and humanitarianism as we move forward. So, first, compassion. This is actually the easiest part of the talk. There are lots of different definitions of compassion, and a lot of them are generated by their own social, cultural, political, and economic context. So there are lots of different meanings that are out there, but the thread that I've always found is that there's a recognition of another's suffering and the desire to do something about it. The other cognate concepts, like sympathy and empathy, don't quite get the action part. Sympathy says, I'm really sorry about what's happened. It doesn't really demand much of us. Empathy suggests that we can put ourselves in someone else's shoes. I know what you're going through. I've had the same experience. I've been very persuaded, though, by some of the recent work that's come out on empathy, which actually says that maybe empathy can mislead us. My co-author, Unni Karunaka, who is a former president of MSF International, has convinced me that he has no empathy. And it doesn't matter to humanitarianism. He can't really know what another person is experiencing. It's impossible. And also, if he thought he knew, that's where things go wrong. Because that's when you think, I really know what you need. and you appropriate it. And so all he needs to know is that there's someone who could use help. That's all. Now, part of the challenge, of course, is that we don't feel compassion for all people. We don't feel everybody else's pain. If we did, if we were an empath of that nature, we'd be overwhelmed. So we have different ways of filtering out not only what kind of suffering we care about, but whose suffering we care about. Now, Martha Nussbaum, who I mentioned earlier, she borrows this according to many from Aristotle, is that there are three things that actually grab our attention and that trigger compassion. And these are also very much embedded in a lot of Emma's work as well. That the suffering must be significant. Not just any suffering, but probably needless suffering and life-threatening suffering. Ideally, on a grand scale, something that becomes a spectacle. Think of the Haiti earthquake or the tsunami. There's a categorization of those who are suffering is that they're innocent, which is often why we have the motifs of children and women, because of the gender representation that represents innocence. You don't find someone like me, an old guy, as the symbol of innocence. It just doesn't work. I've tried that, and it doesn't really convince many people. But here you have, though, that the innocence part is saying they didn't deserve what they got. They did nothing at all to deserve the experience. And so this becomes then the divide for what's often referred to as those who are deserving and undeserving. And we make distinctions based on whether we think some people are deserving or not. And oftentimes this is racialized and other kinds of principles of difference that become shortcuts for us deciding whose suffering we're going to care about. And then lastly, it is the sufferers must be seen as part of our community. That's critical. Which tells us that in many ways, being able to extend compassion to distant strangers with whom we've never met, nor can we expect them to reciprocate if we're in a similar situation, is actually very hard. This is the fragility and fleeting part. Emma's chapter on the tsunami in her book makes clear that the outpouring was great, but it all kind of dissipated a few weeks later. And we see this time and time again in these massive emergencies. There's a way to which we can actually think about other forms in which we differentiate populations in terms of deserving and maybe undeserving, or those whose suffering can be answered with indifference. One is called hierarchies of humanity. And if you look at the last several hundred years, it's a clear sense that some people were treated as human and others not quite so human. They were subhuman, or they were humans with possibility. And oftentimes this meant that they could be treated as lesser. Sometimes it was also, and you see this in terms of the way suffering and pain was depicted for slaves in the American South, was that, well, they're a different race. They don't even feel pain the way like white people do. So we can just dismiss this. But once we treat and see someone as less than us and as not as human as us, then we're on the road to dehumanization. And that with dehumanization comes a permission oftentimes to treat others cruelly. I'm assuming that means 10 minutes. Okay. Thank you. I thought she was really happy, but I had to clarify that. Okay. The other way in which we find, and I just want to note that the language of dehumanization and hierarchies of humanity, we can hear it again. We thought we made progress. We thought we had leveled the playing field, but we were a little too self-congratulatory too quickly. The other one that is maybe more familiar to you are circles of obligation. And here, that mantra of my family first, then my neighbor, then, my neighborhood, then my town, then my country. Then when I'm done with all these other demands, then I'll get to the rest of the world. And the difference between the two is that in the hierarchies of humanity, the presumption is you're not deserving. In circles of obligation, we're not saying that those on the outer are not deserving. We're just saying we have a priority. People play favorites. We're only human. And my sense is that over the last century, we've seen a lot of progress in terms of expanding the circles of compassion, but they're shrinking again considerably. And why is that? Oh, by the way, this was, there has to always be a gratuitous J.D. Vance, but I don't know if you're familiar, it was great fodder in the United States. J.D. Vance had his own interpretation of compassion, which was about circles, and he said that's what Jesus taught, and he told the popes that they were incorrect in their interpretation of the Good Samaritan, and it was a little bit of hubris on the part of a recently converted Catholic to try to lecture the popes on what Jesus meant when he talked about compassion, but you gotta love the moxie. Okay, the thing about compassion more generally is that it requires us to break down boundaries between us and other people. That oftentimes what we see are in-groups and out-groups. And for compassion to reach across borders, we need to somehow create a portal from us to them. The problem, though, is that what we're seeing over the last 10 years or more is a reassertion of these walls between us and them. And there are a lot of theories as to why. I will just quickly dash through them because of time. One is security. Many of us point to counterterrorism strategies in 9/11 as where this all began. And it wasn't simply treating other people like stranger danger. It also began the criminalization of humanitarian action itself. So this is where humanitarians are being arrested. Individuals are being arrested for acts of kindness. It's really quite amazing. But oftentimes, if you think that refugees are your enemy, then clearly those who are helping them in any way must also be the enemy. The global economy and inequality. People are feeling pinched more than ever before. And as a consequence, they're more concerned about their own needs than they were, and I think it's understandable. There's a growth of populism and nationalism and xenophobia, which themselves create or reinstitutionalize forms of difference and discrimination and dehumanization. There's what's called post-humanitarianism, which is, I'll just be brief here, which is kind of a lifestyle choice, where our notion of compassion now is tied to consumer products, celebrities. So we no longer really care about the recipients. What we care about is that Matt Damon told us that we should be following his water projects. Or in kind of what I thought was kind of amazing, I'll just ask you to Google it later, where Save the Children has a partnership with Bulgari, the Italian luxury that has Save the Children emblazed in a lot of their jewelry. Now, my students thought it was cool. They had no problem with it. And they said, well, they're pricing it actually below, what you might expect for a Bulgari product. I was just like, what's wrong with you? But anyway, or what's wrong with me? The one that I find most interesting, and I don't know if there are versions of it in Australia, but it's called toxic empathy. In the sense that empathy is actually a progressive trick. So the left has captured the notion of empathy, and they want you to be empathetic towards people who are not deserving of it. Because Jesus taught that you should not be prepared to show empathy to transgender or to women whose lives are in danger from pregnancy. That's undeserved, so don't be tricked. And it's a very popular position, and it's created a lot of tension within the Christian community. Now, all of the above are happening. It's not just one thing. I don't know what's happening to humanitarian compassion. One of the interesting aspects of the book that I've been working on is trying to figure out, in many ways, whether, in fact, humanitarians are still as compassionate as they once were. And I will just speculate and say no. And there are 5 minutes? Okay. I can work with that. Okay. That there are some dynamics that are going on within the humanitarian community and humanitarian writ large that have dampened compassion. What are they? Well, one is that the humanitarian sector has become rationalized, bureaucratized, professionalized, and for very good reasons. They needed to get their house in order. They had the right purpose, they have the right spirit, but sometimes good intentions are just not enough. And in response to Rwanda and other failings, the argument was that humanitarians needed to get their house in order. They needed to become more efficient and more effective. It could no longer be a circus. It had to be better organized than ever before. And so what you began to see then was a sector that 40 years ago really didn't have many rules, now becomes overstuffed by rules, and everything works by rules. And once you begin to work that way, you're in what Max Weber would call an iron cage. You begin to look like, in many ways, the bureaucrats that Hannah Arendt imagined as part of the banality of indifference. You begin to close off. You reduce people to numbers because that's what you're supposed to do. And in fact, there are other dynamics that have gone on within the humanitarian community that have led and that have reinforced this. There's been an increase in the use, for instance, of risk models, where now everything is a risk, including the very people that you want to help. They're a risk. It also means that knowledge production is one that you do, and with the help of AI and technology. And increasingly, what we've seen over time is that most of these new mechanisms for greater efficiency create more distance between the humanitarian worker and the people they're supposed to care about. And compassion does not work. It doesn't get generated through AI models. It just doesn't. And so one of the consequences of all this is that the elements that traditionally generate compassion, which is interpersonal, which requires face-to-face contact, is less and less so. In addition, one of the things we've seen, and this is actually worthy of a longer conversation, is marketization. Some people prefer talking about this as neoliberalism. But what we've seen is the greater partnership between corporations and humanitarian actors. And what that has meant, it is translated then into a sector that now uses business language to describe everything and talks about self-interest and growth and competition and market share and consumerism and profit and loss and cost-benefit analysis for decision-making. Efficiency becomes the number one priority. You can actually have very long conversations with heads of humanitarian agencies about efficiency. If you ask them about quality, they go silent. They don't know. They don't have any accountability mechanisms developed that put them in touch with those who are the recipients. Their executive staff and their boards of trustees are made up of people who have corporate experience. They're coming from a corporate culture. And this travels down throughout the rest of the organization. And as a consequence then, when you are trained to think in terms of efficiency, compassion drops off. As simple as that. And so what we're seeing is, and frankly, when I've read about the way it is that the aid agencies have handled the budget cuts, where they've quickly closed up shop and have had no transition plan, it was sometimes hard for me not to see, hear elements of Doge. So to conclude, there's that famous word. Okay, to conclude then, I want to talk about a couple of things. Oh, see, look at that, Department of Indifference. Oh, I'll have to skip this. I'll tell you about the book later. Ask me about the book. I've just attended, a marvelous 2-day workshop on images. And one of the things that I kept thinking about in terms of these images is that images are so important for compassion. Now, we get our compassion in many ways. It's mediated by these images. And one of the things I kept thinking about is that, there's a understandable great deal of ethical concern about how it is you represent people in their worst situations. And the problem is that I can show you happy, smiling faces, but we know it doesn't cause you to reach into your pocketbooks. Rather, we give when people are suffering, which doesn't seem very nice in terms of considerations of human dignity. But if we, in fact, change the visuals, so that we begin to show a less suffering people, what happens to our compassion? Will it dissipate? Because compassion is parasitic on other people's suffering. And if we don't show that, then what happens to the kinds of connections that I've described as fragile and fleeting? The last thing I want to note is that there are current trends right now in the humanitarian sector that lead from what many people think is going to be a transfer of power and authority from the West to the South. You know, and I think there's good reason to speculate that it'll move in that direction. This is called localization. What I've seen, though, in the localization movement, though, and it's understandable, is that when people talk about localization, what they mean is our concentric circles of humanity are going to be local. It's not going to be global. One of the things you can at least acknowledge about, you know, Western humanitarianism is it was global. Lots of problems with it, but it was global. And I wonder what happens when localization becomes institutionalized. What will become of humanitarianism is understood as helping distant strangers, and what happens then to our own notions of cosmopolitanism, of the kind of world we want to live in? How do we make sure that we maintain that? And so this is the world that I see us moving into, and I think it really does challenge us in all kinds of ways that we may have overlooked or neglected. And I think it's worth collectively thinking about what are the ways that we can, I have my own thoughts about answering this question about how we can begin pushing that rock back up the hill. Thank you.
I'd now like to welcome Bina D'Costa and Fiona Terry to come up and say a few words, please. So both Bina and Fiona have been working with Roland and Emma on an ARC linkage project that has been going on for a few years now. They are both long-time collaborators and friends of both Roland and Emma. So Bina is a Professor of International Relations at the Australian National University, and recently has been working directly with UN agencies, helping to support policy development on refugees and humanitarian issues. Fiona is an honorary professor here with us in Pulses at the University of Queensland, and until recently she was the Director of Research at the International Committee for Red Cross. She has a PhD from the ANU and has spent 4 decades working across conflict and humanitarian zones around the world, from Somalia to Rwanda to Afghanistan and Iraq. So I'd first like to invite Fiona up. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you. This is really an honour to be able to speak at this inaugural event in honour of Emma and her scholarship. And Michael is never a very easy person to follow, so I would like to tear apart everything he's just told you and give you a much more positive spin, but unfortunately I am a humanitarian, and what he says is actually, a lot of it is correct, and we are in a bit of a crisis. But a special thank you to Roland. This is an amazing ARC grant project that we are working on to try to think through how we might represent images of suffering in different ways. And it was in this field that Emma's work was particularly insightful for me. The way that she was able really to show that the dehumanization that can occur through certain ways of depicting suffering around the world, and provoking the reinforcement of these problematic stereotypes of victims and saviours. So it really was very thought-provoking, and you know, when you're a humanitarian and you're in the midst of a crisis, it's sometimes you don't have that distance, and Emma's work very much provided that distance. But as someone who has spent the last 35, I don't know if I said 40, I'm not, 4 decades, 35 years, responding to suffering wrought by war and oppression around the world, sometimes there is no other way than to portray what is really happening. Some of the stark realities really need to be highlighted, and I'm just think straight away of the images of Palestinians with their empty bowls clambering over each other to try to get some food from from aid organisations dishing it out. And these are horrible images. There is no dignity in these images, and yet it is reflecting their reality. There is no dignity in their lives. And so sometimes I think we have to be very careful not to try to polish too much the images, and we have to, go with reflecting reality. Because after all, what we do want to do is to provoke outrage in the hearts of the public. And we need to wonder because it's the public that makes the politicians act. And so we really need to sometimes, reach for their heartstrings. And I also believe, about empathy, I've never really liked that word. I think I've always been driven throughout my career by anger at the injustices that we see around the world. So I would have liked to have debated with Emma some of these questions about these images, and we really missed her at the workshop that has been going on for the last 2 days. Emma's work was quite theoretical for a humanitarian practitioner audience, but what I loved is that she recognised that, and I was really privileged that she invited me to participate in one of her courses on ethics and human rights, where I was able to interact with the students and had a really good back and forth, even if sometimes I didn't quite understand all the jargon, because I chose not to stay in academia, but to go back to the field and work in the humanitarian realm. But I would also like to ask Emma how we can provoke emotions and actions to gain traction to stop war and genocide in Sudan. I mean, Gaza is absolutely terrible, and it is in the press. Sudan is not in the press at all. And I lived and worked in Sudan from 2007 to 2009. So I'm so devastated to see the same ethnic-based violence that we are seeing today against the same population by the same band of perpetrators, and not being able to do anything about it. And this time the celebrities are not there. If you remember, the celebrities were all on the bandwagon in 2004, and where are they today? Has it gone out of fashion? Is it just not trendy anymore? Is compassion, demoted? What would Emma have to say about that, and have to say about how we can try to generate compassion elsewhere? Like Michael, I have been quite privileged. In fact, I have surfed the wave of the optimism of the humanitarian sector. I started in 1991, post-Cold War. We actually believed that we were making progress, that human rights and humanitarian action was going to trump state sovereignty. That bad word, was going to supersede state sovereignty, and that we were progressing towards something. In fact, we were able in the 1990s, I was with Médecins Sans Frontières, we were really able to influence public opinion. And when I look back and I think of the audacity that we used to criticize states for not doing enough, for only sending humanitarian action as their response, rather than engaging in the politics of stopping genocide in Rwanda. We had this massive campaign, "You do not stop a genocide with doctors." This was directed towards the French government. Do something, humanitarian action is not the solution. Well, guess what? Today, there's not even the humanitarian action. The doctors are not even being funded. So it is a very tragic situation that we are facing, and it's very hard for me towards the end of my career to see that everything I believed in and thought we were making progress towards is crumbled in such an incredibly fast time. In fact, it's even worse than that. I think we are seeing some of the worst instrumentalization of the notion of humanitarian action that we have ever seen. And I have done a lot of study on the history of humanitarian action. And, one of the worst cases in the past was the Ethiopian famine in 84 and 85, when, in order to enroll their starving children into camps, their parents would have to sign up for forcible deportation to the south so that they could not be the fish in the sea in which the rebel fish were swimming and giving them support. And so it was terrible, and we thought how outrageous this is. And then in the Rwandan refugee camps, aid was instrumentalised by the people who perpetrated genocide, and they had fully intended to go and finish the genocide that they started. And it was only the aid that kept them alive and kept them functioning, which is why when I was the head of MSF during that time in the camps, and we pulled out for ethical reasons from the Rwandan refugee camps. And then you think, okay, well, who are the other terrible? The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They imprisoned the Cambodian displaced in camps, and they would not let aid organisations have access. But nevertheless, they did allow WFP, the World Food Programme, to deliver aid to the outskirts of the camps. So when today we see the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation establishing these aid stations, which became death traps for so many Palestinians, 875 confirmed dead, trying to get aid, it really is unprecedented in the history of the humanitarian sector. So I would love to be able to give you a more positive spin, and I hope Bina following me is going to, on the state of the humanitarian system, and I would love that we were able to stimulate once more Hannah Arendt's notion of passion for compassion. And I wish we had Emma here with us to help us unpack this and to discuss it and debate it with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. And so now it's left to you, my dear Bina, to give us some hope for the future.
Thank you. I'll try, Kate. Nice to meet you. Good evening, everyone. I don't want to talk a lot about Emma because I am in many ways a crier. I don't want to burst into tears. And you don't want the brown woman to stand here and burst into tears. So we wouldn't do that. But thank you, Roland, for this wonderful invitation. Emma was a brilliant and interdisciplinary politics and IR scholar and a beautiful human being. Her work is remarkable, as we've been hearing, and her ideas continue to shape the way we think about emotions and world politics. I was so lucky to call her a friend, my friend. And Kate, I think you introduced us 22 years ago almost. Lifetime ago, it feels like. Emma's scholarship consistently demonstrated that emotions are not simply private or fleeting feelings, but they're very central to social and cultural forces that shape political communities. So she talked a lot about communities, and in our conversations we've discussed what we mean actually by when we are thinking about communities. One of our most powerful insights, as we know, was the importance of linking emotions, affect, and bodies to enable a more holistic engagement with how emotions matter in world politics. In her 2019 article for Millennium, she wrote, I quote her, taking effective embodiments, energies, and circulations seriously shines a light not only on how political communities are emotionally constituted and connected, for example, after trauma or indeed around any political issues or event, but also how those connections are inherently open-ended and can, as such, shift and change and transform. Quote closed. At the same time, I felt that she cautioned against reducing political potentials of emotions to the body alone. And this is a conversation I had with her, so I just want to, again, go back to one of her writing, where she said, I quote her, yes, bodies, bruised, maimed, traumatized bodies, and also hopeful bodies can tell us much about politics and ethics, about trauma and violence, exclusions, power, and hierarchies, more perhaps than any theory of ethics or ethics, quote closed. So after this, in 2020, I come back from working in different refugee camps in different parts of the world, and I am completely traumatized, working with children, and that vicarious trauma I carried with me. And I also have carried experiences of a very serious racial attack. So I talked to Emma about it. Roland and Emma were in Canberra after that, in early 2020, when we were discussing about the grant. And I was talking to Emma about that bodies are never neutral. they are also racialized, they're gendered, marked by history of inequality. And we talk about, this is actually from an email exchange I had with Emma, and then she says, Bina, my dear Bina, they also embody voices, identities, and aspirations, carrying, as you say, both the scars of trauma and the possibilities of agency, creativity, and resistance. This is really important, that conversation, because I carried that with me in my current work as the chair of the UN Working Group on people of African descent. And when we went for work in Colombia, where we saw women, African descent women, who were not given pain medications, for example, because there's this understanding that African women can endure more pain, or they're asked to leave the hospitals. Or for our work in Victoria, where we have heard from young men of South Sudan who explained that their trauma and the intergenerational trauma, how that had been explained in Australia as only part of gang culture. So in this way, we know that how bodies are also racialized. So we were very privileged to be guided by Emma as one of the chief investigators of the ARC linkage project. That work is a collaboration across universities and with our industry partners. In many of our conversations over Zoom and in person, Emma was exploring how emotions and trauma shape world politics, particularly in relation to community responses to suffering in times of humanitarian crisis. And we were so lucky at the IR department at ANU, which is in the Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, to host Emma on many occasions and to have her share her ideas with us and collaborate with our other colleagues. Michael talked about how Emma's work also showed us about the fragility in terms of compassion. So her work in terms of fragility and compassion actually led me back to a different kind of question now in 2025. It is about solidarity, and this is my positive spin, Fiona. That compassion that sees only the suffering body risks reproducing hierarchies and turning maybe people into objects of pity. Solidarity, by contrast, insists on seeing the whole person, not just their wounds, not just their difference, but their dignity, agency, and humanity. So solidarity is not actually a luxury at this point, and as many of my colleagues and other human rights defenders have said, that solidarity is actually a verb that is necessary in a divided world. So it's a principle that binds communities together across borders, especially in times of democratic backsliding, shrinking aid budgets, and growing inward-looking politics. So solidarity requires us to stand together, to act as allies, and to resist exclusion and fragmentation. When the world feels as though it's falling apart, Emma's work, through that, now I see solidarity is an important thread through which I can think about not only erasing difference, but about embracing it while committing to shared responsibility. In this moment, solidarity, I feel, must be our practice, not fleeting compassion that fades with headlines, but a deeper commitment to stand alongside one another, to defend democratic values, and to nurture collective responsibility. So I say, after all this, thank you, Emma, from all of us.